The lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that never aired. It was another ordinary day at the Waterson house, but something felt different from the moment Gumball woke up. The sunlight streaming through his bedroom window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows that didn't match the furniture. Darwin was already awake, sitting on the edge of his fishbowl with an expression Gumball had never seen before. "Did you have the dream too?" Darwin asked without turning around, his voice carrying an unusual weight that made Gumball's fur stand on end. "What dream?" Gumball replied, though as soon as the words left his mouth, fragments of something dark and twisted began flooding back. Images of endless corridors, doors that led nowhere, and a voice calling his name from places that shouldn't exist. Darwin finally turned to face him, and Gumball noticed that his friend's usually bright orange color seemed muted, almost gray around the edges. "The one where we're walking through the house, but it never ends, where every room we enter is the same room we just left." A chill ran down Gumball's spine because he remembered now. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, that waking up seemed like the dream instead. In it, they had wandered through their own house for what felt like hours, but every hallway stretched infinitely. "It was just a dream," Gumball said, trying to convince himself as much as Darwin. But as they made their way downstairs for breakfast, the house felt wrong. The stairs creaked in patterns they'd never heard before, and the family photos on the walls seemed to be watching them. The kitchen was empty when they arrived, which was unusual. Nicole was always up early preparing breakfast. Richard typically slept in, but even he would usually be wandering around by now. The silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence pressing against their eardrums. "Mom! Dad!" Gumball called out, his voice echoing strangely in the empty kitchen. The echo seemed to last longer than it should, bouncing off walls that suddenly felt much farther away than they remembered. As they searched the house, calling out for Nicole, Richard, and Aeneas, the building seemed to shift around them. Rooms they'd known their entire lives felt unfamiliar, as if the proportions had changed overnight. The living room seemed longer, the ceiling higher, and the furniture appeared to be positioned just slightly wrong. "This is exactly like the dream," Darwin whispered, his voice barely audible. "We keep looking, but we never find them." They climbed the stairs to check their parents' bedroom, but when they reached the top, they found themselves facing a hallway that stretched much farther than it should. Doors lined both sides, far more doors than their house had ever contained. "There are only supposed to be 4 rooms up here," Gumball said, counting the doors and losing track after 12. Each door was identical to the others, painted the same shade of white, with brass doorknobs that reflected their distorted faces. They opened the first door, expecting to find their parents' bedroom, but instead discovered their own room. Confused, they backed out and tried the next door, only to find the same room again. The third door, the fourth, the fifth, all led to identical copies of their bedroom, each one slightly different in disturbing ways. In one version, the walls were painted a shade of blue that didn't exist in nature. In another, their beds were positioned on the ceiling, defying gravity. A third room contained furniture made of crystallized shadows, solid enough to touch but transparent enough to see through. "We need to get out of here," Darwin said, his orange color now completely drained to a sickly gray. "This isn't our house anymore." But when they turned to go back downstairs, the staircase was gone. In its place was another hallway, identical to the one they were already in, stretching endlessly in both directions. The walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched their heartbeats. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, or maybe days. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this twisted version of their home. They wandered through endless iterations of familiar rooms, each one wrong in subtle but disturbing ways. In one particularly unsettling room, they discovered family photos where their faces had been replaced with blank spaces, as if they had been carefully erased from their own history. In another, they found their parents sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of their children's presence no matter how loudly they called. "They can't see us," Gumball realized with growing horror. "It's like we don't exist to them anymore." But just as despair began to overwhelm them completely, Gumball heard something that cut through the supernatural silence, the sound of Aeneas crying. It was faint, distant, but unmistakably real in a way that nothing else in this twisted house had been. "That's really her," Darwin said, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time. "If we can find Aeneas, maybe we can find our way back." Following the sound of their sister's tears, they began to run through the endless hallways. And for the first time, the house seemed to respond differently. Doors began to slam shut behind them, walls started to shift and change, and the very air seemed to fight against their movement. But they kept running, following that one real sound in a world of illusions, determined to find their way back to the family they'd lost, back to the home they remembered. The lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that never aired. It was a Tuesday morning at Elmore Junior High, but something felt different from the moment Gumball and Darwin walked through the front doors. The hallway seemed longer than usual, stretching endlessly, and the familiar chatter of students was replaced by unsettling silence. When they reached their lockers, Gumball's combination no longer worked. The numbers seemed to shift and blur whenever he tried to focus on them. Darwin watched nervously as his best friend struggled with the simple task they had done hundreds of times before. In their classroom, Miss Simeon was nowhere to be found. Instead, their classmates sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead with unnaturally wide smiles. Penny's shell shimmered with an otherworldly glow, while Banana Joe's brightness had faded to a sickly pale color. Tobias sat motionless, his rainbow colors slowly draining away. Gumball tried to get their attention, calling out to his friends, but none responded. Their eyes remained fixed on the empty blackboard. Darwin pointed to the clock. The hands were moving backwards, and with each tick, the classroom grew dimmer. The school bell rang, but it sounded wrong. Instead of the familiar chime, it produced a low, droning tone. One by one, their classmates began to stand in perfect unison, their movements mechanical. They turned to face Gumball and Darwin, their smiles growing impossibly wider. Gumball grabbed Darwin's fin, and they ran from the classroom, but the hallways had changed. Doors that should have led to other classrooms now opened onto empty voids. The lockers stretched up toward a ceiling that disappeared into darkness. They found themselves in the cafeteria, where lunch ladies continued serving food to empty trays. The smell was all wrong, sweet and cloying. Steam rose from untouched meals, forming shapes that looked almost like faces. Darwin whispered that they should go home, but when they tried to leave through the main entrance, they found themselves back in the same hallway. The school had become a maze with no exit. The final bell rang, but instead of students rushing to leave, the building fell completely silent. Gumball and Darwin stood alone in the main hallway, watching as the lights began to flicker and dim. In the growing darkness, they could hear faint laughter coming from everywhere. As the last light went out, Gumball reached for Darwin's fin, but found only empty air. He called out his brother's name, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. When emergency lighting kicked in, casting eerie red shadows, Gumball realized he was alone. The school around him began to shift and change, walls melting and reforming. He ran through corridors that led to more corridors. In the distance, he could hear a school bell ringing repeatedly. Gumball followed the sound, but found himself in his own classroom. On the blackboard were the words, "Class dismissed forever." In the corner sat a figure that looked like Darwin, but its eyes were black. The lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that never aired. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning at Elmore Junior High when Gumball noticed something peculiar about his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His reflection was smiling, but Gumball wasn't. When he tried to frown, his reflection kept that unsettling grin, its eyes following him as he moved away. Darwin was waiting by the lockers, but something was different. Darwin's usual cheerful demeanor seemed forced, his smile too wide, stretching beyond what should be physically possible. When Gumball mentioned the strange mirror incident, Darwin's head tilted at an unnatural angle. "That's wonderful, Gumball," Darwin said, his voice carrying an odd echo. "The mirrors are finally working properly." In Miss Simeon's classroom, every reflective surface told the same disturbing story. The windows, computer screens, even his desk showed his reflection behaving independently. While Gumball sat still, his reflection was writing frantically. During lunch, Aeneas approached with her usual confidence, but her pink fur shimmered strangely. She carried Daisy the donkey, but the stuffed animal's button eyes appeared to blink when no one was looking directly. "Brother," Aeneas said, "have you noticed that everyone's shadows are pointing toward the old storage room in the basement?" Penny floated nearby, her shell crackling with sinister energy. Tobias was there too, his rainbow colors shifting in patterns that hurt to look at. Even Banana Joe's usual jokes fell flat. The school bell rang, but instead of its normal chime, it produced whispers in a language none of them recognized. Students began moving toward their classes, but their movements were too synchronized. The hallways seemed longer than usual, stretching endlessly. Lockers opened and closed by themselves, revealing contents that belonged to students who had graduated years ago. When Gumball reached the basement storage room that all shadows pointed toward, he found his family waiting. Nicole stood there in her work clothes, but her blue fur had taken on a metallic sheen. Richard was present too, his pink form somehow more substantial. "We've been waiting for you to understand," Nicole said, her voice carrying the same strange echo. "The reflections, the shadows, the whispers, they're all trying to show you something important about Elmore." The storage room walls were covered with photographs of every student who had ever attended Elmore Junior High, but in each photograph there was an extra figure, a blue cat that looked exactly like Gumball, but with eyes that held knowledge of things that hadn't happened yet. "Elmore isn't just a town," Richard explained. "It's a place where stories that were never told come to live." As Gumball stared at the photographs, he realized his reflection hadn't been misbehaving. It had been trying to warn him that he was about to become part of a story much